What we're building here is a reproduction of the Lackawanna Railroad as it would have looked in 1952. We're covering the area of Hoboken and out into the New Jersey countryside to Cranberry Lake, then out by Scranton and into Trousdale mine area. In the journey we also go through Netcon, and these are the areas that you'll see modeled. Some of the areas are actually represented in the backdrops, like Scranton, for example, is painted in the backdrop in the distance. Be much too large to build in any kind of scale where you could bring it up to the foreground. The rolling stock is authentic to the period. What John has done, he's either bought or had built certain cars that would have run on certain trains. I built some of the cars along with Kermit Paul, the modern lightweight cars, and a fellow by the name of Ralph Brown, who's now deceased, built several of the heavyweight coaches. So basically everything you see is custom built, with a few exceptions. Some of the locomotives were off the shelf, but are custom painted for the railroad. Designing a railroad, you have to combine a lot of things. So you have to have the mechanical knowledge or know the people that have it to do the basic layout of the railroad. You have to have an understanding of how a railroad works. A model railroad works just like a real one. You have to have sidings, you have to have switches in order to put trains on their route and take trains off. It's a little bit like working a puzzle sometimes and figuring out train operations. So that's an area where a lot of model railroaders will stay. They don't go beyond the running the trains. That's the main thing, which is fine. I like to go more into creating the whole illusion of a miniature world. All right, we're in the Cranberry Lake area right now. This little painter, I bought him at a train show, and he's O scale. And this happens to be a metal figure. And Lena painted them. Being an artist, she already knows all the techniques for painting, so it's natural for her to paint these. And she adds a lot of detail. A lot of these figures, the better quality ones like this one, the details are in the castings, and it takes a good painter to bring them out. But you can see all the details in the clothing and everything. As we have a painting he's working on, so I made a little easel, and I have a picture of the Cranberry Lake Lodge that he's painting. And if you could see 180 degrees around, you'll see that's what he's looking at. From this position, he's looking at the lodge. One of the things that we're trying to achieve here is an authentic look. And a lot of these parts you can't buy, so we have to make them. And we're trying to make them look just like the actual part. For example, this is a gate used in the station. And in order to get this exactly like the original, we looked at photographs and duplicated the exact pattern that they had on that gate. And to make this, we're laser cutting it out of plywood. So this is like very thin plywood, 1/32 thick plywood. The laser cutter is a really nice tool to have. It really enables you to make a lot of these parts that you wouldn't be able to make any other way. You can't buy them, so you end up finding parts that you can buy that kind of look like it but aren't exact. Now we can do exact duplicates, and actually relatively fast compared to having to scratch build things piece by piece.
This is our representation of the massive train sheds at the Hoboken terminal of the Lackawanna Railroad. The roof was constructed of many parts cut from wood and plastic and all glued together and painted and so on. The columns you see here are made from brass wire which has the footings in it. At the top, the Capitol, the original Capitol was based upon what is there now, Lena Yarmenko carved a master of that capital with all the ornate details. And then from that master, molds were made, and hundreds of these were cast in a plaster to go on top.
This is one of the columns, and the plan was made from looking at pictures in the book. And Lena handmade the first piece of the column capital. Then we made a mold, and we cast this part out of resin. So we made probably about 100 of these, and then cleaned them all up, and then used these as our column caps. This is the column itself. Kind of an interesting process. This is what's called pinion wire, which is like a gear, and then it's cut to the length we want. And a gear is too deep, so we put a little piece of plastic in there to kind of build it up. And you'll see on the layout where this is painted green, it looks just like the original ones. These are in the Hoboken terminal. These are the gates that the passengers would go through to get onto the trains. These are the fences that are in between the trains, so you can't run across the tracks. This is going to be a door, the passenger door. And there's a lot more that goes to this. There's a stained glass that goes in here, and glass in here, wood panels in here. I try to look for things that when a person looks at them, subconsciously they say, that makes sense. Yeah, I believe it. I believe that could be real. And it takes kind of a little bit of artistic talent, I guess. I'm not a painter, but I would say three-dimensional art, where you can take objects in the three dimension and set them up. I go for the whole feeling, like if you can create things around the railroad that bring you into it. This is one of my favorites. This is a folding chair, and you remember we talked about the patterns that we saw in the catalog when Lena painted the canvas part to look like the typical 50s striping. You can see none of these things are like store-bought, so you have everyone's a little bit unique. So there's a little different pattern. If you notice, there's a little bit of red in here. So you'll notice that they have 3 different patterns here. So everything's a unique piece. What we have here is a drive-in movie, and John can't remember specifically what the drive-in was like that was in the area, but it was on Route 46, so I came up with this drive-in that would represent a typical 1950s drive-in, and we call it Route 46 drive-in. And we have a typical neon sign they would have had back in the 50s. And these are actually designs that came out of a book showing old drive-ins. So this is the drive-in movie screen, and it actually shows movies. It's one of those picture frames that you buy, digital picture frame. But to create the illusion, you'll see the movie here. But to create the illusion that there's a projector, we actually have a little LED in here that flickers. So when the movie's going, you can see the flickering like the projector, and if you can see through this window, you can kind of see the projection booth kind of flickering. All the little speakers are all handmade, and they actually have a little speaker box on the end. Of course, it's not a real speaker, but we have the little wires and the little boxes. So anybody that grew up in the 50s and 60s probably remembers drive-in movies. Now, this is also a way to display our car collection. There's probably 10 times as many cars around here that we can't display. There's no room to display them. So parking lots and a drive-in movie are a good way to display cars. This is a model of the Trousdale mine. This was an interesting project, mainly because it was a very large facility, and we really didn't have a lot of room to build it in. So what we did to get it to fit in is build it in forced perspective. So you'll see that the walls actually are built so it looks like it's going off into the distance. And we have actually several scales here. It's actually O scale on the front, and it turns to O scale, then HO, and we actually have N scale in the back, so it gives the illusion that it's far away. Okay, laying the mine out, something we try to create is a little bit of balance, because it is so large. You don't want to just have it sticking up in the middle of nowhere. So we had to ad-lib a few things, like, for example, this little coal tipple here. That wasn't actually there, but there were several of these tipples in the area, and they may even have had one in a different location. But basically what it does, it kind of completes the scene, and this is a place where local guys would go to pick up coal. You'll see we have the station attendant weighing out the bag of coal, and the coal will come out of those chutes. Over in this little area here, we have a little maintenance shop, and you'll see the welding equipment in there and some other tools and such. And we have a little shack there that was used for weighing the trains as they came out of the coal yard. And we have some equipment and things. These are just things that we thought would add a little interest that weren't necessarily there, but they're not really out of place because it's the type of stuff you'd see around a coal mine.
I assist on a number of the engineering matters on this railroad, anywhere from design of the lighting systems for the passenger cars to the control of the tracks to the design of the Hoboken terminal, the lighting effects, the design of the programmable logic controller that controls the show, controlling the audio, the storm effects, the lighting, and so on. So essentially anything of a technical nature that is required on this layout, Jack asked me to do that. Some of the challenges that we've encountered on this project are based on the fact that the scale of the layout that John Scully selected is 1/32 of the full size. That is the correct scale to represent the equipment we're modeling on the track gauge we are using. It turns out in the hobby industry, most manufacturers of locomotives and cars, for some reason, selected a scale of 1/29, which is not correct for this gauge track and represents a size about 10% too big. So we've been forced in many cases to have locomotives custom built and or modified from existing commercial product line. An example of that is the 15 cars we had to construct for the Phoebe Snow passenger train. None were available in the scale that we could use, so we bought 30 short cars that were correct in scale, not the correct length nor the correct window patterns. Cut them in sections, glued 2 cars together to make one of correct length. We then had to machine away the entire window paneling, laser cut correct paneling that matched what the Lackawanna Railroad actually used, insert those into the car bodies, paint them, put on correct roofs. The lighting was interesting. We wanted lighting that would be very effective at night, so we developed and used rather than light bulbs, we are using electroluminescent paneling in the ceilings of each car with a special electronic circuit to stop them from flickering as the trains go down the track and to keep them bright and constant at all train speeds. So that was a bit of a challenge. Other challenges, of course, are the fact that these trains, with particularly the passengers with the lighting, draw a significant amount of power. As evidenced by the control units in front of me, these are able to produce 15 amps of power at about 20 to 24 volts. So it's a lot of power in the rail. We had the challenge of having rail, wire, switches appropriate to that size to get the power to the track without losses. So there's a lot of very interesting challenges. In addition, lighting, for example, at Hoboken, we've got well over 100 specially colored LEDs, light emitting diodes imported from China to produce that effect. So overall, quite a bit of challenge. Another major area of challenge is the various shows. We have one completed now, whereon we are using a small special purpose computer called a programmable logic controller. This coordinates the playing of a number of audio tracks at various locations on the railroad. It coordinates the lighting effects, up, down, storm, day, night, and so on, as well as various cabin lights around Cranberry Lake. Ultimately, it will control animation, so it's just like a Disneyland ride, if you will, on that basis. So there's a lot of very interesting technical challenges on a railroad of this complexity.
So by the time World War I broke out in 1917, or at least our involvement was 1917, Phoebe Snow was probably the most popular girl in America. And little girls wanted to be like her. They were dressing like her. Kind of, when you want to equate it to somebody like today, it's hard to put into terms. But the newspaper articles from the time really portray her as one well-liked woman. She was ladylike in every way. During World War I, the government took control of all the American railroads, and it changed everything. The Lackawanna burned anthracite coal. Everything was well maintained. When the government took over, it burned bituminous and everything. It sent anthracite over to Europe for the military use. So the railroads in this country all burned bituminous. So everything got dustier and dirtier, and it wasn't maintained to the same standards. And this happened all across the country. It wasn't just the Lackawanna. It wasn't until the 20s when the government returned the railroads back to the private companies that they were. But meanwhile, no longer burning anthracite, Phoebe kind of disappeared with World War I. After World War I, the Lackawanna was also burning bituminous in its locomotives. And she didn't return until the electric trains. In 1931, when Thomas Edison pulled the throttle of the first electric multiple unit car, which everybody knows them as MUs, there was a woman there portraying Phoebe Snow, who worked for Thomas Edison. She was one of Thomas Edison's receptionists, and the railroad dressed her up as Phoebe Snow, and the limerick for that event said, "Steam steps aside, and now you ride upon a road electrified." When railroads were really competing for passenger service, they all had their own marketing niches. And the print media at the time, newspapers and magazines, you had black and you had white. There really wasn't much in the way of photos. Photography was a new technology, so you didn't see a lot of pictures. Most of the graphics in advertising were just drawings and pen and ink and black and white. And each railroad, they used bolder type, they used whiter type, they used outlines, they came up with clever phrases. So every railroad was vying for something different. Lackawanna was trying to promote the fact that it was clean. Its trains were cleaner. You could ride in an open window coach and not get your shirt covered in dust and soot from the cinders and from the locomotives. And the name Phoebe Snow, there are several legends. The most common one was that it was the cleaning lady of the marketing man who came up with the name, and in New York. And his cleaning lady was named Phoebe Snow. Phoebe Snow is a nice rhythm to it. The last name lends itself easily to rhyme. Who knows how long they labored over coming up with names? Who knows if they looked at 50 names and played with them? But Phoebe Snow was chosen, and the limericks all work. They all flow very well, and that's how the name got chosen. And in 1949, the train was christened the Phoebe Snow, and that was the first time Phoebe actually had a train named for her. And it was known for its fine, elegant dining, classy service. And John, of course, has ridden the train and fell in love with it, and you see that train represented on his railroad today.